Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. We're diving into a topic today that I know a lot of you have been curious about, late autism diagnosis.
Hmm.
We've got a lot of requests to unpack this, and we actually have a really thought-provoking blog post that a listener sent in called Cheap ABA, 5 Reasons Why Autism is Missed. It's got some really interesting points about why diagnosis can sometimes happen, well, later in life than you might expect.
Yeah, it's something that we see a lot. And one of the things that tends to trip people up is how someone can be autistic and excel academically.
Right. It's like you think of academic success as a good thing, obviously, but this post points out that it can actually mask those autism traits, particularly when we're talking about kids.
Exactly. A lot of autistic kids have these, really intense interests that can actually give them a real advantage in school, especially in those early years where things are more structured.
Yeah.
So those social differences might not be as apparent.
They fly under the radar for a bit.
Exactly. But then, as the academic demands kind of ramp up and those social situations get more and more complicated, that's when those autistic traits might become more noticeable.
It's like they hit this point where those old coping mechanisms just aren't cutting it anymore.
Yeah, you see it a lot.
And it's interesting how something like academic pressure, which you wouldn't necessarily immediately connect with autism, can be that trigger.
Yeah, for sure.
The post even mentioned things like rocking, or maybe avoiding eye contact, or even having meltdowns, being kind of misinterpreted as just typical anxiety or social awkwardness, especially if a child is doing well academically.
Oh, yeah, all the time. It's a
Hmm.
classic case of misdiagnosis, which unfortunately is a huge reason why we see those later autism
Because
diagnoses.
you just don't have all the pieces of the puzzle yet.
Exactly. We label behaviors based on what we think we know, but sometimes those labels don't tell the whole story.
Right. It's like looking at one tiny piece of a huge picture. And speaking of misdiagnoses, the post mentioned a few, specifically ADHD, OCD, and social anxiety disorder. Like these are often mistaken for autism, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. They can look incredibly similar, especially in kids.
And I imagine that can be really tough because if you're on the wrong track with treatment,
Oh, absolutely. A child who's having trouble focusing in a busy classroom, for example, might get labeled with ADHD, when really those attention difficulties are stemming from sensory overload, which is, very common for people on the spectrum.
so it's about digging a little deeper
Yeah, and sometimes that doesn't happen.
and looking beyond just those surface behaviors.
Exactly. You got
It's
it.
like trying to solve a math problem, but you're using the wrong formula.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually a really good segue into this next point because the post talks about how the actual diagnosis of autism, like the criteria, has changed a lot over time. And that can be really confusing for people.
Oh, for sure. It mentioned the DSMV. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the DSMV, it's like, think of it as the rule book that clinicians use to, diagnose all these different mental health conditions, including autism.
Makes sense.
And before 2013, conditions like Asperger's syndrome, those were considered separate.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but the DSMV, it brought everything together under this umbrella of autism spectrum disorder.
That's a big change.
Huge shift. And, I think it left some people feeling kind of lost.
Yeah, I bet. Especially if you were used to that old way of thinking about it.
Exactly, because, some people who might have gotten a diagnosis under that old system, they might not meet the criteria anymore.
Wow.
And on the flip side, people who were maybe overlooked in the past, they might now be
And
recognized.
it's like the goalposts moved.
Yeah, exactly. It just highlights how much we're still learning about autism and how our understanding is always, growing and evolving.
And what might have been considered like outside the box a few years ago is now like textbook.
Totally. And that's why it's so important to have, clinicians and therapists who are really staying up to date on the latest research.
Oh, absolutely. They got to stay sharp.
Because, yeah, the guidelines are always changing.
Yeah. And speaking of things changing, the post also brought up this really important point about the gender gap in autism diagnoses.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a big one. Studies show that, females who are autistic, they're often diagnosed way later than males.
Is that right?
Yeah, sometimes not even until adulthood.
Wow. And the post mentioned that a lot of this comes down to societal expectations and maybe even some unconscious bias, right?
Definitely plays a role. We have such different expectations for how boys and girls should act. Like a girl who's quiet or withdrawn, she might just be labeled as shy or well-behaved, but those same traits in a boy might raise some red flags.
It's like those subtle differences in how autism can look, especially in those early years, it can be really easy to miss.
Yeah, they can fly under the radar. And then you add in the fact that research suggests autistic females might be better at, like, masking their traits.
Interesting. So they're kind of adapting to those social situations, even if it's really hard for them.
Exactly. It takes a lot of energy, but they learn to kind of blend in, which, it makes it even tougher for people to recognize the sign.
Oh, I bet. That just makes me think about how emotionally exhausting that must be.
Oh, absolutely. But the good news is I think as awareness grows, we're getting better at like spotting those more subtle signs
Yeah.
and understanding that autism, it doesn't look the same in everyone.
Right. It's a spectrum, like we keep saying.
Exactly.
And that kind of brings us to another point from the post. And it's something that's really important to me. The idea that even getting a diagnosis can be a privilege.
Oh, absolutely. Access is huge.
Like not everyone has equal access to healthcare or even information about autism.
Yeah, it varies so much depending on where you live, your socioeconomic background, all of that plays a role.
Not a level playing field.
Not at all. And this can lead to, huge disparities in who gets diagnosed and when.
The post specifically mentioned children of color, especially Black children, facing even more obstacles.
Absolutely. It's a huge issue. And it just highlights how critical it is to make sure that everyone has access to those resources and support, regardless of their background.
Right, because early intervention, it can make a world of difference.
Huge difference. And it all starts with, like you said, having access to accurate information and knowing the signs.
And feeling empowered to speak up.
Exactly. It's not just about awareness, it's about action.
I love that. Awareness and action.
We need more training for educators, for healthcare providers. We need more research into like how autism presents differently in different people.
It's about building a system that's really equipped to support people at every step of the way.
Yes, exactly. Not
Yeah.
just when they finally get that diagnosis.
And that, I think, is a perfect place to pause,
Yeah, for sure.
because we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. And, it's important to remember that this is just like scratching the surface in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely.
But hopefully it's given our listeners some things to, think about and maybe even some next steps if they're, on this journey themselves.
Exactly. And before we get to those next steps, I do want to hear, were there any other key takeaways from this deep dive that you think are really important for our listener to walk away with?
I think one of the biggest things we've kind of touched on throughout this whole conversation is that it's rarely just one thing.
Right, yeah.
It's not like one single thing that leads to a late diagnosis. It's this kind of combination of factors.
Yeah, and they all play off of each other too, right?
Exactly. You've got these societal expectations. You've got the fact that our medical understanding of autism is constantly evolving.
And then you layer on top of that,
Yeah.
these systemic barriers that we talked about, right? Access to healthcare, cultural differences, it's a lot.
It is. It's like this perfect storm. And then add in the fact that autism is a spectrum.
Which means it can look completely different from one person to the next.
Exactly. So it's no wonder that, even experienced professionals sometimes have a hard time putting all those pieces together.
It's definitely not as simple as just checking a few boxes, right?
No, not at all.
It requires a much deeper understanding and a willingness to really look beyond those, I don't know, those kind of typical assumptions about what autism is supposed to look like.
Yeah, we have to be willing to throw out the rule book sometimes.
Right, because everyone's experience is so unique.
Exactly.
And that's really what makes these conversations so important. The more we talk about it, the more we challenge those outdated ideas and hopefully, open the door for earlier diagnosis and support.
And better support, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it's one thing to get a diagnosis, but then it's okay, what happens next?
Right. What kind of support is available? And is it the right kind of support?
Exactly. And that's where I think, self-advocacy is so huge.
Oh, I was just going to say that.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and something's resonating with you, if you're wait a minute, this sounds familiar, don't be afraid to speak up.
To ask questions, to do your own research.
Yes, because you are your own best advocate at the end of the day.
And sometimes just having that knowledge, having that awareness, it can make a world of difference.
For sure. Even if you get a diagnosis later in life, it can still be so validating.
Absolutely.
It can help you understand yourself better, connect with other people who get it.
Find your community.
Exactly. Find your people. And that's really what I hope people take away from this conversation.
Me too. It's about giving you the tools and the information to advocate for yourself or for your loved ones.
Exactly. Because knowledge is power. Right.
Knowledge is power. That's it. All right. Well, on that note, I think we've done a lot of unpacking today.
I think so, yeah.
We've explored some really, really important and complex issues around late autism diagnosis. But, as always, we want to hear from you.
Yes, keep the conversation going.
Let us know your thoughts, your questions, anything that resonated with you. We want to hear about it.
And if you found this helpful, please share it with someone else who might benefit,
Yeah.
Spread the knowledge.
Absolutely. Because that's how we
Yeah.
learn and grow together.
Exactly.
All right. So until next time, keep those curious minds engaged and never stop diving deep.
Keep diving.